Shalom, Rabbi, and thank you for taking the time for this part of my program, Profiles of Faith. We're here today, June 14th, 4th of Tammuz, with Rabbi Avraham Marmorstein at this shul, Minchat Chinuch, known as the Babat Steeple at West 100th Street in New York City. Rabbi, how do you like to be called?
Rabbi is okay.
About Rabbi Marmorstein, he is president of the Council of Orthodox Jewish Organization, Projo of the Upper West Side, a member of the National Council of Synagogues, Rabbis of Agudat Israel, and author of several books on different halachot. Rabbi Marmorstein has a long, illustrious record. After co-founding the Jewish Learning Experience in Cherry Hill in 1977, you followed in as a spiritual leader and pulpit rabbi, first at Ohev Tzedek in 1980, known as Ozi, and in 1987, you accepted at the request of Kahal Minchat Chinuch, the Babat Steeple, to be and to serve as a spiritual leader. You've done that while helping the community as director of a widely respected community-based kosher supervision service, Mehadrin, where many establishments and the broad Jewish population depends on it for its certification. I may add that there's no shortage of pulpit rabbis, but how could we make it without shopping at so many dependable establishments such as Kosher Mart, Fairway, to list but a few, for which your certification helps making it possible. But before we go over your accomplishment, Rabbi, I met you at this congregation, Minchat Chinuch, known as Babad. We just moved to New York. It was during COVID, and joined the Steeple when you struggled to maintain a minyan. And I should add that despite many who ignored masks and social distancing, you followed all the CDC guidelines religiously, pun intended. I never attended the Steeple regularly, and I was struck by the welcoming attitude of both you and the congregants. For the purpose of clarifying, and before we proceed, can you tell us what is a Steeple and how does it differ from a typical synagogue?
I think historically, a Steeple had the idea that it was the home of the people who davened there. They didn't gather there only in order to daven, they also gathered there to learn, they also gathered there to extend fellowship, to be companions to each other, and to daven. And they would also have shalashidus and tikkun and so on. I think traditionally, the shul really didn't have that. It's more of an American innovation that the shuls are also competing with the shtiblach and offer a good kiddush and so on. Historically, the shul, you look at old shuls, they didn't have a social hall. That's new. They came there, they davened, and they went home. They ate at home. The Steeple, you could eat after davening, you could hang out, you could sing.
I think, from what I understand, the Steeples in America and in Israel are also following the local shtetl from which they came. Basically, the rabbi was the Steeple was the rabbi, and that was it.
You know, we live in a time after the Great Destruction. So after the Great Destruction, every Rebbe who set up his own Steeple wanted a little bit to keep alive that which had been destroyed.
In his own shtetl.
Yeah.
In his own community back in Europe. About the Steeple, are they black hat, haredi? What is the difference between the two, and where do you see your direction?
I would say that a Steeple like this was traditionally, predominantly, a black hat crowd, but I think it's also important here that it welcomes everyone and that people come of all backgrounds.
Even people like me.
You're from the tzaddikim, you're from the echte heimische.
Thank you. So, what is the difference between the haredi and black hat? Can you tell us?
I hope one is attitude and one is uniform. A black hat is describing people in terms of their the clothing that they wear.
Right.
Haredi hopefully means a concern to fulfill the requirements of halacha and religious thought conscientiously.
Yeah, but black hat is referring to dress code, and haredi people who try to follow the halachot. But do you think it's more
One would hope.
ideology, more chumras, more, chaos and...
This is a bigger conversation. Some of it depends on how you grew up. Some of it depends on which element within the Jewish community you wish to connect to. People express allegiance often in a tribal manner. If I wear a tall spodek, I'm tribally aligning myself with the Gera. If I wear a conventional shtreimel, I'm aligning myself with the other groups within the Hasidic world. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zechron Levracha, yesterday was his Yortzeit. The Lubavitcher Rebbe always wore one old battered hat.
Right.
What's the story of the battered hat? When his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, died, there was some debate as to which of his two sons-in-law should succeed him. And the old Rebbitzin, his mother-in-law, didn't want to give out the Friedrich Rebbe's shtreimel. So she kept it. And the Rebbe said, I'm not going to get my own shtreimel until she releases the shvers. Until then, I'm just going to wear this one old hat. I'm not even going to update it with a new hat. I'm waiting for the shtreimel.
You tried to embarrass her?
And afterwards, he was afraid that he'd made a neder to not buy another hat, and he kept on wearing the same hat.
I always suspected that he had few battered hats, and he kept...
Maybe. But this was the story. People do express allegiance with hats. So there are people who wear a knitted kippah. They want to be seen as connected to the world of those who wear that as their chosen headgear.
So it's like a uniform.
It's that kind of thing.
Okay. Now, I ask these questions because people are fascinated with shtibels, mostly people who don't go to shtibels. And I fell in love with the shtibels, and I don't look back. I'm really find it very inspiring to daven in the shtibel, and in a way it makes me more connected and aim for higher. And I think many people, it could help many people. Also, a lot of shtibels don't have a younger next generation, so it would help to repopulate the shtibels, so to speak. Now, are shtibels usually Hasidish?
What I started saying about the idea that a shtibel was exclusively Hasidim, originally to be technically a shtibel. The Hasidim had the awareness that there must be Hasidish shtibel, a home for the Hasidim. It's used today much more loosely. Any kind of small, informal shul will often be referred to as a shtibel. But technically, that's not so. There are, technically, a shtibel had a Hasidish core to it.
The other ones are called a minyan.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Because I came here during COVID and I saw how you struggled to, and the whole community struggled to keep it open with the distancing and with the mask and with people's fear and whatnot. How did you manage, and what perspective have you attained during this dark period?
So it presented an incredibly difficult problem. On the one hand, we have a very strong feeling one should keep davening with a minyan in strengthening each other going no matter what. On the other hand, we knew that this was really a communicable disease and that gatherings were the source of spreading it. So the question was how to balance these two opposite concerns. We were closed, I think, about 6 weeks or so. And then when we opened, first we didn't have the minyan actually in the steeple. We had it, we found an apartment which could be, have windows open on all sides so that it was completely cross-ventilated. We had some occasions when we had the minyan in the driveway, an outdoor minyan, and eventually when we moved back here, it was deliberately with a bare minimum minyan, very widely spread out. In the beginning, just for minyan, and then we left, not 1 minute afterwards. Then eventually we had the socially distant Kiddush, where we provided everyone with a little bottle of schnapps and individually wrapped steeple mezoines, and maximizing social distancing. And gradually...
It was Kiddush to go.
Yeah, no, but even to stay, but it was like totally separate. And gradually we were able to allow things to relax as people were vaccinated, more people could come back, and we were somewhat normal.
We know that some communities didn't adhere to that.
Yes.
They called it, they wanted to build a herd immunity, or they thought God will help, it's all God's will, or we're doing God's work, or we cannot stop it. How do you view this outlook?
Jewish communities are like the rest of the world. Everyone has a different response. Everyone reacts differently to things. Some people are just less compliant. I know religious Jews who drive over the speed limit too. They're just, it's not a philosophy, it's just a thing that they do. I think that it's not the right thing to do when you show a communal policy of ignoring it. Every individual will make their own choices. I know people who ordered all their groceries from Amazon, and I know others who went into the stores. I have to say, for me personally, the thing which was most frightening to me was my obligation to keep kashrus inspections going. And that meant going to the places where food is manufactured and prepared. And I knew that if I didn't go, it wouldn't be properly supervised. I had one time in one of my local stores, both my regular mashgichim came down with COVID at the same time. I spent more hours than I could count in a crowded environment with people coming in and out. They were restricting the number of customers coming in, but they had to have people working to prepare the food. And there I felt I'm really sort of putting my life on the line a little bit. I never felt that way as far as the minyan was concerned.
Right, but it's really interesting that you took that upon yourself to, and you had this a sense of responsibility for the community.
I was under contract.
It's like being in a battle. You take one for the team.
You see, I also work as a hospital chaplain,
right.
And I was in the hospitals right through that time, but there I didn't feel at risk, because there I felt the whole environment is so structured to avoid risk, with every patient who came in was being tested immediately upon admission, and those who were COVID positive were in different units where nobody entered without full protective equipment. There, I didn't feel I was at risk.
Let me ask you a question. This pandemic, they say, once in a lifetime, which we hope it is. Did you attain any perspective about it from it being Yad Hashem? There must be a message, or is it just there's sometimes bad ladders, as we know in the story?
I like to think that some of the message is one that we had to hear. We can be overly social. There is a danger to our community. What if everything becomes conforming with the crowd? And everything becomes who is included and who is left out. Do you know how much pain people feel when they feel left out? It's a horrible pain, and it's more common, and people will not generally admit it. When people are about 50 years old and they write autobiographies, they will sometimes say, you know, in school, I was the kid nobody wanted to play with, and no one wanted to pick me for their team. But they never tell you that until they turn 50 or 60, and it's become ancient history.
So your message is that it will give people the empathy and the understanding what it means to be socially isolated.
I think that's true, and I think it also is teaching us to reorganize our priorities. Our priorities should be what we do, and do we do right and do we do wrong, not where do we belong, where did we attend, which chevra did we hang out with.
Because the price is not the way you see yourself, but the price can be the risk to you and your family and your fellow colleagues and your fellow congregants and your fellow people.
Well, that was at the time, but I'm just thinking overall, the enforced isolation and I don't know if we'll ever go back to emphasizing large gatherings the way that we used to.
I thought that you are bringing another point. We often think that what we do wrong is just affecting us. Like if we open the window and throw something out of the window, it may not be nice, but you know what? The garbage truck is going to collect it ultimately. All of a sudden, you live in a world where everything has consequences. If you go into a group and you test it positive and you don't tell everybody, you literally are condemning people to possibly die. And I think it trains people to think about their behavior in less frivolous manner.
That's also true.
It is impossible to cover everything you've done within the short time. But before I start asking you about your childhood and so on, I want to acknowledge that I met your wife, Sarah, and I was most impressed with her contribution to the community. And I thought of having her here also and trying to highlight the role of the rabbi and the rebbitzin as a couple in managing the community. We often talk about the rabbi, but we give a nod to the rebbitzin, but we kind of leave it behind. The rebbitzin is really the glue of the community, right? Tell us more about the role of the rebbitzin in general, of how your wife...
I have no idea about the role of rebbitzins in general, because I'm married to a very unique rebbitzin, and she is not typical. Typically rebbitzins, that's another story. My wife...
My wife is special.
No, she really is. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you a part of it, which, to be perfectly honest, this is a modest-sized steeple. I don't deal with very large numbers of people in the steeple. I deal with very large numbers of people in my role as a rabbi in the community. I answer questions of halacha for large numbers of people. Some of them are not even in the area. They just, for whatever reason, are comfortable asking me questions. So I have a big community that I'm connected with, but not large numbers in the minyan. My wife, everybody knows her way beyond the shtibel, and she fusses over hundreds of people.
Let's remember that she does do the kiruv and the worry about the community here. Let's remember that during Shabbos, Melech Hamaariv, there's women meeting across the street and that she facilitates.
Far more than the number of men who come to me. She's a powerhouse.
But also she calls and reminds.
Yeah.
And she is the trumpet.
No, she has her own following.
Right.
Separate business from mine.
Yeah, but she participates with you in the greater community.
Yeah,
she does a lot
absolutely.
If you need something, or if you have something, or if you want to, you call Sarah, and she'll tell you where to get it, who to give it to, and whatnot.
She's unbelievable with that.
She's a Karlbach, right?
Yes.
Tell us, how is she related to the Karlbach?
Okay, the singer Shlomo Karlbach,
the Rabbi Shlomo Karlbach.
Singer Rabbi Shlomo Karlbach, his father, Naftali Karlbach,
another steeple that was created.
But that wasn't a steeple. That was a little shul.
Right.
Eli Chaim made it more of a steeple.
Right.
But it was originally a small shul. Rabbi Naftali Karlbach, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, came here before the war and became a rabbi in Crown Heights. He wasn't happy with the Young Israel of Crown Heights, where he was the rabbi. So when there was an opportunity to take over a small shul on the west side, he moved here with his sons. His older brother was my wife's grandfather. Naftali's older brother was Rabbi Yosef Tzvi. Rabbi Yosef Tzvi was extremely prominent in Germany, and he became chief rabbi of Hamburg-Altona, and he remained there till the end, and he and his children were deported and killed al Kiddush Hashem. One son, the oldest of the children at home, is my father-in-law, who survived the concentration camps and eventually came here to New York.
I know a little bit about how rabbis and rebbitzin work, because the most successful shuls that I've attended in my life usually had a rebbitzin, that you knew her name, and you knew that she made things happen. So a big nod to rebbitzins, and we wish to include them more. About my program, Profiles of Faith, my theme is about tradition and its transmission throughout the generation. You're an important link in this chain. Can you tell us about your family?
Okay, so I am proud to say I'm a real mongrel. I am a mixture of many different traditions. And I like being that way, although it can be confusing. My father, Zechron Livracha, was himself half Hungarian, half Galicianer, and he came to England as a child, and then before World War I.
Wow.
He then later went back to learn in yeshivas in Eastern Europe, and he then completed his academic studies. He was very much of an intellectual. He was also a chassid. He then moved to Eretz Yisrael and lived near Meir Sha'arim and was very much a part of the life of that community. And from there he went to Baghdad, Iraq, where he was the principal of a large Jewish school, and then returned to England.
Was he not a broadcaster for the BBC?
He was a broadcaster for the BBC. That's
not for the Jewish community.
No.
So he mastered both sides of the aisle.
No, he was Cambridge educated, intellectual.
So how come he most religious Eastern European Jews didn't go to get academic education? We know,
my grandfather already had studied.
So why? How come?
Because people would like to think the world is black and white, but it isn't. So it's very easy to say, Oh, there were the secular Jews who dropped their religious preferences and traditions, and there were the religious Jews who lived their fanatical lives locked up in their little tenements where all that they spoke only Yiddish and so on. But in the real world, it wasn't like that.
We know a lot of successful big rabbis, from the Rav to the Lubavitcher, to others who are in Liechtenstein and so far, that did master academic world.
But even among lay people, it's an oversimplification to say that nobody studied. When my father was a Cambridge undergraduate, and before that when he studied at the University of Bonn in Germany before the Nazis, there were other frum people there.
Right.
It wasn't that everyone fits into these two categories. So my family came more from, I guess you'd call them the worldly sophisticated Orthodox Jews, not from the small village ultra-traditional.
So they lived in the big cities. Is that why?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Medium-sized towns.
I understand that you followed in the footsteps of your own parents and acquired advanced university education. You completed your Master in Science in Bioethics at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Why was it necessary if you wanted to become a rabbi?
Oh, this was much later. It wasn't when I wanted to become a rabbi. As a rabbi, I didn't obtain any advanced secular degrees. But much later on, after I'd worked as a hospital chaplain for many years and become involved with ethics committees and medical decision-making and so on, I decided that for the hospitals where I worked, it would be useful to have a credential with formal training in bioethics. So then I went, later in my career to obtain a Master's of Science.
Is that what brought you to the kosher world?
No, I was involved with kashrus early on. To some extent, when I came to the West Side, it was a bit of a kashrus jungle. I think the only place which had a proper kosher certification and standards when I moved here in 1980 was Meal Mart on Broadway, which was sort of an outpost of the Brooklyn Heimische world, and Mendel's Meal Mart. Everything else either had a very low level of kashrus, like most of the butchers were not glatt and were a little shaky, would sell meat which hadn't been kashered, hadn't been soaked and salted, and a lot of people would eat at places which didn't really have any kosher standard to speak of. There were a couple of small butchers who were personally reliable, who sold only glatt meat, but there was very little formal supervision. And I agitated for straightening that out and getting things which were reliable and kosher. I wasn't planning to make a living out of it, but as a result, I got more involved in that.
So tell us, on one foot, what is involved in being a mashgiach in a kosher, in general, in kashrus?
I don't have a way of explaining it on one foot, but I would say there are two parts to kosher supervision. This is not a summary of the laws of kashrus. There are two parts to kosher supervision. One is when something is kosher anyway, you're not making it kosher, you're just guaranteeing that it is kosher. Like along comes Yankel Shmerel and he says, I run a kosher store, I'm a religious Jew. Well, no one knows whether they should believe him or not.
Right.
The supervision of a rabbi means I've checked this out. It's true. And I've investigated, his claims are reasonable. Or when somebody puts a certification on orange juice, it means Not that orange juice has any innate problems with it, but it means this is not the orange juice which has oysters added to it to increase the amount of calcium in the orange juice. And it's not the orange juice which is packaged on the same equipment which packages milk and shouldn't be eaten with a meat meal. It's just guaranteeing it. There's no real work involved. Right. That's part one of kashrus supervision. Part two is when there are two ways of making something, and one way would make it kosher and one way would not. Like shechting chickens. If you shecht the right way and you check the chickens the right way afterwards, then they are kosher chickens. If you then defeather them without hot water and you soak and salt them, then they become kosher and ready to cook. So there you actually have to make something happen which renders them kosher. I would say those are the two parts of kashrus supervision.
We spoke about your father, but we didn't mention your mother, Aliyah Shalom, who just passed away recently at the age of 100. And she was a very accomplished woman. Can you tell us about her?
Yeah, my mother would not have wanted people to make a fuss of her. She kept quietly to herself, but she really was a very bright woman, and she loved studying. She, at any time when we were growing up, there was a big house to run and a large family, and there was never a time when she didn't have a couple of nights a week when she was going out to classes to study. There was never a time she didn't go running to the library to get some good literature to read. And she was, in different times, a teacher and a translator. And she liked to say when she was in her 90s, I never really retired. Just with all these great-grandchildren constantly inviting you to simchas, you can't get any work done anymore.
Who do you take after?
Probably the worst of both, you know.
Well, tell us more about you as a child. You grew up in London. Can you take us through your Jewish life?
Okay, I grew up in a very comfortable, pleasant neighborhood called Golders Green. We lived in a large house with a nice back garden, and we grew up thinking there's nobody who doesn't have fresh things growing in the back garden and the pleasures of fresh blackberries and raspberries and tomatoes that have just been picked. We thought everybody had that. Everybody had space to play a good game of cricket. It wasn't quite big enough for a soccer game. For that, we had to go to the park. There were parks nearby. I do not remember being afraid in our neighborhood of anything. If we went to a bad neighborhood, there we were afraid that somebody might come and use a fist on you and call you a dirty Jew or so on, but not where we lived.
This was Golders Green in the 1950s, right?
Yeah, 1950s and 60s. Yeah. Very comfortable neighborhood. It was not that heavily Jewish, but it was sufficiently Jewish that there were kosher stores, there were several Jewish schools, several shtibelach.
You were raised as a black hat, haredi, traditional?
All the above. Actually, I was raised with some of that conflict that I alluded to in the background. We davened only in the frumest of the shtibelach. We certainly, once I was bar mitzvah, always went to shul with a hat on, very respectable black hat, or navy hat sometimes. In England, a navy hat counted it was just as good as a black hat. So we had that on the one hand. On the other hand, my father had quite a bit of his family who were also active in the mainstream community, the United Synagogue community, so we were exposed to the broader community. My father felt very passionately that we should get a well-rounded education. It was extremely important to him. He wouldn't send us to the frummest of the frummest schools. He'd send us only to schools which also offered a good general education. We were all very musical. I took violin lessons. My sister took piano lessons. We were taken to the opera and to the ballet. So I wouldn't say I grew up with a like ultra-Orthodox background, but we davened in a very heimische steeple. Every Rebbe who came to town, my father made sure to take me along to the tish. I was pushed to have all worlds open in front of me.
Who are the most influential people in your life as a child, beside your parents?
You know, the Rebbe of our steeple, Reb Chuna Halpin, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, he had a very strong influence on me. And I was close to him until he died a couple of years ago. I was very much under his influence. Later, Rosh Yeshiva and so on, but that made a big difference.
Did your family travel?
We traveled a little, and in the summers, when I was a little older, like already bar mitzvah age, then we started to travel more often to continental Europe. We'd go to France and to Switzerland.
To visit the sites or to visit Jewish
Visit sites, and there was a bit of family scattered around there.
Who were your heroes in the Torah as a child, and now who are the people who inspired you most?
I'm in favor of all of them. I don't know if I think that way. I don't think that I'm one of those who says, David HaMelech, I really like him because he made up beautiful poetry. No, I don't think that way.
Okay. When do you remember yourself feeling God independently for the first time? When did you feel like your own sense of inspiration or discovering Hashem in any which way that you can describe?
I'm not sure. I think that probably came when I was already more of an adult and more feeling Hashem is enabling me to go through with everything. The first time I became aware of danger and being safe. Otherwise, I felt it much more, and I think I still do feel much more, an all-encompassing sense that Hashem surrounds me, and that He's with me in everything, and less of like the single miraculous event, and much more, Hashem is protecting me. Lo ira ki ato imodi. I don't have as much fear as other people.
Was there a certain event or time in your life where you felt that you crossed some major line that divides between the God for children and God for grown-ups? You know, God that if you behave nicely and you do your mitzvahs and learn well, mommy's going to come home.
I don't know if I ever had that.
No.
I'm not sure if I ever had the childish belief in being very simple. At home, I grew up with too much adult sophistication when I was very young. Mm-hmm. When I was 8, 9 years old, I was more comfortable talking to adults than to children. I was often bored by my contemporaries.
That's why you chose to be a rabbi. Keep talking to adults. But you're looking for the adults in the room.
They're all part adult, part child.
All of us.
And they're all hoping somebody's going to come and bring them chocolate.
or a little bottle.
Oh, that could be.
Did you ever have conflict about observance in your earlier years, in your older years? Now, did you have doubts?
Not a lot. I have doubts about the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things. I do worry. I'll give you an example. Schmerel's Bakery is very strictly kosher, but the people push and shove to get in there. So it's offensive to my sense of order and doing things in a nice and considerate manner. But it pleases my sense of stringency in halacha, that I'm sure that every egg was checked before it got mixed into the challah. Down the block is the other bakery, where I know just as well that they do not check the eggs. They rely on the fact that they're battery eggs, they're industrial eggs. They assume there are no blood spots. Nobody checks nothing. But it has a, kosher certification, and it's very pleasantly run. Everybody waits in line and nobody shoves and pushes. So do I compromise my sense of human stringency and treating people right and not shoving? Or do I compromise on my sense of being strict about the observance of halacha? Such things, I can't tell you the answer. Should I daven in the minyan, which davens too quickly, or should I daven in the minyan, which davens slowly? Well, I can't tell you.
Life has a lot of conflicts, but I asked more about the conflicts about the boss. Meaning you go to hospitals, you saw this now, this COVID.
I often have the sense of my own weakness, where I think to myself, maybe I should try to understand more of what goes on around me, instead of just saying, not understandable. No human can understand it.
Yeah.
I don't think I think along those lines of, this is reason to doubt Hashem's existence.
Okay, you're a lifer.
Yeah.
Yeah. What inspired you to become a rabbi? And can you share with us your sense of love of Hashem, and how can one love Hashem, a God who is so omnipotent?
As I see it, I think I was drawn to being a rabbi by the fact that I have an unusual mixture of liking ideas and people. I don't think I could write only about ideas locked away in my study, but bringing ideas to people and helping people and discovering new things about people. There's no way to find out about the richness of the world as that of a rabbi. You find all kinds of people. It says I think one of the commentaries of Shulchan Aruch says, when you give a eulogy for somebody, say the good things that you know about them and add on a little more, because there's probably more good stuff that you don't know about. I cannot tell you how many times when I got to know somebody better, I discovered a depth you would never have known from a casual acquaintance. And they sometimes open up and share that with me as a rabbi. And I felt also a little bit, I come from a rich background of incorporating many different things. So there are many different kinds of people who will be willing to take me into their confidence and share with me. And perhaps that's a way of serving Hashem. Maybe I can't sing like a Shlomo Carlebach. I can't perform intellectual feats like the most brilliant Rosh Yeshiva. I cannot make money as well as Warren Buffett. There are many things that I can't do that well. I'm not a super athlete, I'm not a super endurance champion, but I could try and include people and reassure people that there's place for them in Hashem's world and in Hashem's faith community, the faith community of the Jewish people. there's room for everyone. And they need to be reminded, there's room for you, and we need you too.
It's beautiful. Do you think that the Jewish family structure in America today has changed fundamentally, and is it affecting how our tradition, Jewish observance, is being transmitted and foretold to our children? And how do you see the future of Jews in America?
Different communities have different changes. I think in the very strictly Orthodox community, there is actually an overly strong family structure. I hear people who have anxiety attacks over whether does every married sibling have to come to the Vachnach, the night before the bris milah, or is it enough to come to the bris? Do you have to keep your high school aged children home for the day in order that they can attend their cousin's family simcha? They obsess about this a little bit. In the more modern Orthodox community, I see some of that, but not as much. And I even find there's a difference between suburban communities and urban communities. I have friends here who moved from the suburbs to Manhattan, and they said in the suburbs, comfortable places like Englewood or West Hempstead, where there are a lot of religious Jewish families, the kids will go off at 14 years old to the youth minyan of the shul, and then they'll go on to their friends' homes, and the parents won't see them again till after Shabbos. In urban communities, it's still a little more family-centric, that people eat with their parents, at least on Shabbos, sometimes during the week too.
Yeah, the beauty of it is that they are raised to do it with their children down the road, because you repeat what you see. It is beautiful because we all hope that our children will stay in the fold, but we cannot do it without traumatizing them, hopefully, in the ways of a Jewish family and Jewish practice. Do you see the future including a more strong modern Orthodox, maybe conservative and Reformed Jews in the future? Or are they in a decline?
I wonder. I just wonder, wearing my other hat in the work I do in the hospitals, I see Jews of all types equally. And it is very hard to predict. Clearly, I also there see fewer middle-of-the-road conservative and Reform Jews than before. But those that I do see seem to me to have a thriving community. It moves, it changes. Everyone knows that outside of the Orthodox community, intermarriage is widespread. I don't know if we estimate correctly how widespread and how much impact that will have, because from what I see, a lot of intermarriages are the second marriages, and a lot of intermarriages don't last. Both of those will not produce new births into the community. So I think we don't yet know. The jury is still out. I met this family whom I got to know very well, Jody Jimenez. As you might guess, her husband is Spanish and non-Jewish. But Jody is very, very active in her non-Orthodox synagogue, and her son volunteers for every dvar mitzvah that is going on in their community, with his father's encouragement too. And if Jody is typical, there can be intermarriages which produce active members of the community. I think it's too soon to say. Of course, if you look at demographics, the Orthodox community is growing, the non-Orthodox community isn't really, but we don't know exactly. And we don't know how many people who never admitted their Jewishness will come out of the closet and admit that they're Jewish.
We don't know also the reasons of the decline, of course, as a friend of mine said, we were a lot more Jewish when people didn't like us. Now that they like to marry us, it's easier to move on. But
they were intermarrying back then.
yeah, but Judaism is also perceived as very strict. To a new, non-overly Orthodox family, it's kind of scary, and it's hard work, and it's very strict. And also, it seemed as not moving with the times, which obviously it doesn't want to move with the times because it keeps the tradition. The whole main reason for Jewish practice is to follow the yoke that we have now for 3,500 years. So you can say part of what makes Judaism is keeping with its past. But there is a sense also that Judaism is not evolving in some areas and frozen and unchanging. For instance, a woman's role in the family has changed. She's an earner. She has a legal voice equal to a husband. When it comes to a Jewish role, has that changed? Does Jewish observant women have more of an involved egalitarian role in the changing world? This is a big deal today in the modern Orthodox world. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I like talking about that. I like to start out by saying the drive to have women fulfill active roles in the community is probably coming from a good place. Women should be involved. Women should feel that it's their world. We don't realize how the post-World War II growth of Hasidim is a very feminist trend. Today's Satmar and Lubavitch and other Hasidism are extremely feminist. The women played a big role in the rebirth of religious Judaism after World War II. Even those who didn't have any formal Jewish education, they were very committed to it, and they often felt they knew which way they wanted their families to go. I knew old-timers who would tell me, they would say in Yiddish, before the war, if in Warsaw you asked one of the frum ladies, which Hasidus do you belong to? They would say, my husband is a Bobover. My husband is a Gera. He said the first time after the war in the DP camps, after he'd been liberated, he met a woman who'd already started again dressing like a frum lady a few weeks after liberation, and was being very careful about davening. And he saw that she was helping to run the kosher kitchen. So he said to her, Die bist da, von wemens Chasidus is dan Tate gewein? Whose Chasidus did your father belong to? And she lifted her head and she said, Ich bin a Kloisenberger. I am a Kloisenberger. My father was something else. The women who'd been liberated, they picked which Rebbe they were followers of. This was a whole new trend. And it's true today. If you know a lot of religious families, the wife and mother's orientation will determine it, because we live in a world in which both parents are very much involved in saying, where do we fit in to the community as a whole? The secondary thing as to whether women give speeches in shul or not, or so on, I understand where that's coming from. And of course, it makes sense to me that a woman who in her day-to-day life is a very senior professional will find it uncomfortable if in shul she's never given an active role. I can see where that's coming from. But I think it's also important to know the active role isn't that important. As I like to tell people, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein couldn't daven from the Amid. He never led a minyan because he didn't have the voice for it. But he was the greatest rabbi of the generation. So it doesn't necessarily matter whether you get called to the Torah for an aliyah or whether you lead the prayer service. You can be the number one anyway.
Moshe Feinstein was very happy with his role, but the woman who is brilliant and works with a lot of her men colleagues, and she has a lot to share, and she wants to share it, she may not feel comfortable being excluded, and she may even think that this is patronizing and condescending to say that she should be happy with her role because it's a good role and she doesn't need more than that. But I think that most of the answers to all of these questions have to do with the fear of change. And that fear of change is always puzzled for me. Why would people who are basing their life on faith fear change? Why would you be so afraid of change?
I think you'd get a lot of arguing about what does fit in with halacha and what doesn't.
Didn't we always have that? The microwave, cars, we always had been challenged. Electricity, we've been challenged about how this works with halacha.
But not really. There are occasional things where people didn't come to an agreement, but for the most part, as new inventions came out, a consensus of opinion formed how to fit those new devices in to the rubric of what we'd done before. This is a suggestion for very big change. You ask, why are people afraid of change? I don't think that typically Orthodox Judaism is very accepting of God's will in that way, saying, take a laissez-faire attitude, let things happen as they happen, and it doesn't matter because it's all God's will. I think actually Orthodox Jews generally are fighters, are very unaccepting. They very much believe we have to push to make things happen the way that we feel is right. We probably all deal with change differently. You look at today's Jewish music, it's, to my thinking, has incorporated a great deal of non-Jewish elements. A lot of very strictly Orthodox Jews have no problem with that, as long as there's proper separation. If the concert has a mechitza and the men and women don't sit together, that makes it a very kosher event, even if the rhythms are from the nightclubs.
You see,
other people would argue, no, then the rhythm is not kosher, even if the seating is kosher.
There's a lot to be said about this topic, but what I see here is people were going to use cars. Rabbis didn't sit and decided, should we use cars or not? People were going to use cars and microwaves and washing machines and light anyway. It's a case of what is first. In the case of cars and electricity, they forced by their presence and Jews using them, the rabbis had to contend with it. They had no chance of saying no. In case of role of women in shuls, the rabbis said, I'm not so sure, and they moved elsewhere. Cars didn't have a place to move to a community that uses car, and this is a community who doesn't use car. This community uses microwave, this community doesn't use microwaves. But women who wanted to be more involved in Jewish life moved to the conservative movement because the Orthodox movement didn't accept them. In this case, the ideological side dictated what and how the everyday life is going to be. There is a major distinction here where ideology pushed the innovation. And another aspect of this is, in the Talmud Sanhedrin, we determined that the pshara, a compromise, is better than chumrah, the law that piercing the mountain, But today's Jewish world is backing away from that. It's much more about chumrah. And that is part of the role of Jewish women and other such things, they see it as the no pshara. The pshara is afraid because look what happened. The uncle's kids have become intermarriage, and beside it may lead to mixed dancing. You know, I'm a little bit playful here, but this is a serious question.
Right, but I think, firstly, there always will be, and probably always were, many different choices and elements. There will be Orthodox Jewish women who decide, I have to go to a more egalitarian congregation. I don't know if we could stop that happening, but I think most of the rabbis will still feel we want to run our minyan, our service, the way it was run. And they would say pshara is for compromise within different halachic positions, and they don't consider that to be an acceptable halachic position.
Well, that's the question, because it's not halachic, it's more of a minhag, such as women learning and so on.
You know, I don't know. I don't know if the premise of that is true. I tell people, if you look at the introduction of Shulchan Aruch, the author of the Shulchan Aruch writes, it contains halacha and also customs and also kavanas, intentions that a person is meant to have. It was never conceived of as being a dry halacha system. There are lots of things which we call halacha, which are not really, because the whole premise that there's a hard line dividing halacha from non-halacha isn't really true. Like wearing a yarmulke, we talk about it as halacha. Really, it isn't halacha.
Right.
It's a Gemara which says that in order for somebody to keep the fear of heaven upon himself, he should cover his head. It's a midas chasidus. It's an act of piety. It's become the standard because there isn't really a hard and fast dividing line. There's a hard and fast dividing line. Is the chicken kosher or treif? Is the mikveh a kosher mikveh or not a kosher mikveh? Davening, if you know somebody who he doesn't like davening that much, so he skips a lot of psukei de zimra and says ashrei. If he does it as a matter of principle, we call him a reformer. If he does it just because he finds it hard to daven, he doesn't say people shouldn't say the rest. We say, okay, so he didn't daven so much.
Well, about innovation, I want to bring it away to another aspect.
Yeah.
The rabbinic period had to contend with a tremendous challenge in the transformation from the temple generation, where Jewish life was centered around the temple, and future generation who didn't have the temple anymore. They renewed Judaism in what we call complete revolution. Our generation must formulate Judaism to people without books, without texts, without a shtetl, who are free to go anywhere. Are we not in a similar transformative period, and don't we need a revolution to bring Judaism to a new age of people who are just as transformed today as the post-temple generation was?
I'm not sure. I think, firstly, we left the shtetl, it's well over 100 years. For most people. Statistically, pre-World War II, there were so many Jews living in large cities that the shtetl Jews were a small percentage. So they did exist, but really we were out of the shtetls. In Poland, between the wars, every single Jew, every Hasidic yingel went to a public school for his secular education. They were out of the shtetl already. There was still maybe a shtetl mentality. We're not really in the shtetl. We're not without books. Our books actually, we are better endowed with books and texts than our grandparents. And people like them and use them. And even if they use them electronically, but we're not that different. We are very different, I think, if there's a way in which we're revolutionized. We're different, for instance, in having an ingathering of the exiles. We're not living, for the most part, in places where our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived. That's a real change. And we're in contact with Jewish communities of all types. You could daven only in a steeple because you like davening there, but you might, let's say like me, if I was driving home on Friday afternoon, I sometimes tuned in on WQXR to hear the service of Temple Emmanuel. It wasn't where I'd pick to go and daven, but it was like, it answered my curiosity. What is a Reform synagogue's Friday night service? It was on the radio, so I could listen. I think those kind of things are new. I don't know how we'll respond to women, but I know also that, that tendency is out there.
But we also say that there's no halachic court, there's no Knesset Agdola to change. But the truth is that Rishonim and Achronim and Gaonim, they all change things. But I think that
we're changing all the time. But we're not changing in sort of major dogmatic ways.
Right. So how are your children practicing differently than you have? What do you see different in their Jewish life, beside the anecdotal difference between personalities?
It's a good question. I would say those of my children who are married and settled down are overall in the same part of the religious spectrum that I am. Those of my sons who are still single, I don't yet know how they'll settle down and find themselves. One of my sons is, for instance, very attracted to outdoors, out-of-town life in smaller places. I think I was also attracted that way, but I didn't wind up making that my permanent home.
Well, about different topics, current events, anti-Semitism is on the rise, new government in Israel, no haredi parties in the coalition. Are you following all of that? Do you have any opinion or insight as to what's going on?
Oh, I think your censors might take out what I think about in Israel. In Israel, I think they were overdue for a change. I think it's a very interesting experiment to see what will happen. I don't think the religious Jews there were well represented by their parties in the Knesset, who I think are sort of a little too traditional and looking for partisan advantage instead of looking for the overall advantage.
You're talking about the old
group they took care of their own.
Yes.
Most Orthodox Jews felt they had no representation at all because they were not connected to people who, for practical reasons, just worked with the big power blocks.
Right.
The big power blocks are not the reality. Mm-hmm. So I think there is some hope. I have no idea whether the people will keep their part. It's interesting to me how many people there are in the new coalition who are rather sympathetic to the very Orthodox. I was very struck by the interview given by Matan Kahana, who, interestingly enough, although he's right-wing party, not an Orthodox party, but he is a graduate of the school in Kibbutz Chafetz Chaim, which is considered a very Orthodox kibbutz. I think it could go anyway, but it's a good change.
What about this new old Altenoi wave of anti-Semitism going on?
So I think we have to see where that's going. There, I don't feel that I have much understanding of it. To me, it looks as though it's being whipped up by those who are trying to make business out of
Misery.
Out of Palestinians and out of imaginary anti-Muslim preference. The Muslims are gaining numbers of adherents in the Western world, and they are backdoor supporters of anti-Semitism, whether they mean to be or not. But they do, in fact, encourage the idea that it's the Muslims who are getting an unfair deal, and by implication, the Jews are part of those who are giving them the unfair deal. So whether they mean to or not, they add to the waves of anti-Semitism.
Is anti-Zionism a new form of anti-Semitism, or is it just related to the Palestinian plight?
And the answer is half and half. You know, it's a little of this, a little of that.
How do you see this, the esoteric topics of Mashiach, Olam Haba, Haret Yamim, all those...
He's coming soon, but I can't tell you when, even if I know. I'm sworn to secrecy. He'll be here. I think we probably should talk more about it. I will tell you that dying patients in hospitals, not necessarily Orthodox, have often asked me, sit down and tell me exactly what Jewish traditional beliefs are about life after death.
You know, I wrote an article recently called, Are We All Atheists in a Foxhole? Meaning, when times are hard, do we all rely on the old, you know, God helping us, or maybe there is a future in where we're going? Do you think that's what it is, or do you think there is a craving for a more spiritual part that comes in place where we are more mature and less busy running around?
So if I have a minute, I will tell you that I think that in this area we made a massive mistake. Most Jews who are not Orthodox, they love religiosity and they love Hashem. And some idiot told them that it's all about observing the details of the mitzvahs. Then some non-Orthodox rabbis decided, if we're going to be a little lackadaisical about Shabbos and marrying a Jew and other things, we better change our opinions about whether there is a God and so on. The guys in the Reform Temple, they're happy to have the same God and the same 13 principles of the faith that we say. They want a little more tolerance on driving on Shabbos, on eating treif when you're traveling, on marrying whoever you feel like. On that, they'd like tolerance.
So
but they're perfectly because they'd changed the belief system. The conservative and reform felt obligated to change beliefs. Their members don't care about they love the Orthodox beliefs. They're not looking for something else. They need something else on the practical side.
So you're saying the rabbis had to make an ideology to accommodate.
They made an ideology to fit. They shouldn't have. They should have said, stick with the old ideology.
Well, the Catholics knew how to do it. Say three this and that and go back.
Well, I think we also made another mistake here, which is we made synagogue membership very, very important. It shouldn't be. In the steeple, it isn't. you are a part of the steeple if you come sometimes. In fact, there are many places where there is a person who comes to the steeple once a year, and when there's a Melave Malka, he sends a very modest check. And the Rebbe still invites him to everything because he's still a part of it.
Beautiful.
If you are a Reform Jew, you don't have that choice. You either have to cough up $2,500 a year and be a member, or be totally disenfranchised.
And you don't have a seat on the high holiday.
Forget a seat, he doesn't need to daven so much, but he needs to feel connected.
Yes.
Then he gets listed in the next Pew study as unaffiliated. He doesn't want to be unaffiliated. He wants to be a Reform Jew who's retired and living on Social Security. And he therefore can't afford the $2,500, and he doesn't need the Hebrew school anymore because his children are all grown up. He would like to send a nice check once a year and still be listed as a part of the community.
That is a good place to end in redoing and undoing the mistakes. I have one more thing to ask you. I ask usually the rabbis I interview to sing a nigun that's meaningful, maybe from your parents' dish. And you mentioned musicality. I've indulged in your beautiful playing and voice, so please share with us a nigun. So
I'm going to take a little bit of a nigun that isn't familiar to people, and I'll tell you why. It's something I heard from my father. It was sung in our family, and it isn't known. Siz givein amula yuhas, hotte gepastet schuf, is auf ihm gefallen a tiefen Schlaf. Wenn is oboiv gekimmen, hat gesehen, als an schäferlich Sehne nicht du. Gita geschrei, Baranyo, Baranyo, als ein schäferlich Sehne nicht du. Als ein schäferlich Sehne nicht du. Geht Rabbi weiter, seht Rabbi mit Äppelach, meint die Sennen die schäferlich Skeppelach. Gitara geschrei, Baranyo, Baranyo, als die schäferlich Sehne nicht du. Als eine schäferlich Sehne nicht du. Geht a bissel weiter, seht a hohe in Streu, weiß als die schäferlich Sennen schon doi. Geht a geschrei, Moran de Vishmayo, Moran de Vishmayo, Azan schäferlich Sehnen schon doi. Azan schäferlich Sehnen schon doi. It's a very romantic song of the love of the shepherd for his sheep. The shepherd is the Ribbono Shel Olam, and his sheep are us, the Jewish people.
I heard of it.
And he sees they've gone missing. First place he looks, there are more verses, I'd shortened it. The first place he looks is the tree with its apples, the sin of Adam Arishan, and he doesn't find them there. Then he sees the deep well, the sin of selling Yosef. He thinks maybe he'll find them there and bring them back. He can't bring them back. Then he sees the magnificent stone building, the Beis Hamikdash. He thinks he'll find them there. Doesn't find them there. Finally, the shepherd sees a pile of straw where everything is hidden. This is the end of the exile. Then he knows that he's going to find them there. So when all happens, we've been through so many things as a people, but one day Hashem will look under the straw where we're all hiding, and he'll bring us back. So I picked that nigun firstly because it is soulful and evocative, and it's evocative of my home and my parental tradition, and that music is meant to be used to keep feelings alive and well, and that all our feelings are meant to be, we're going to take everyone home, not just the people who fit in the steeple, and not even the people who fit at the massive gatherings, which we don't have anymore due to COVID, but even the people who never even knew they were invited to the Siyum HaShas. They didn't even know about it, and they didn't even know to come to the Carlebach concerts. But Hashem is going to bring them all home.
Well, it's a good message to end with. And
Thank you.
Thank you for indulging us. But also this nigun gave range and voice to your beautiful voice.
Oh, thank you.